Thank you for coming to the final session of having the talk, and we're really pleased to have with us Dr. Uzma Quraishi. She's a newly minted PhD in history here at Rice. She's also the project manager of the Houston Asian American Archives, housed at the Chow Center of Asian Studies. Her work focuses on migration among South Asian immigrants and issues of race and class. Please join me in welcoming Uzma Quraishi.
So we are the diehards. We actually stayed the entire day and now we're here ready to talk. And I encourage you to go caffeinate yourself if you feel sleepy at any time. There's tea out there, but let's stay alert for this. My talk is beyond black and white and focuses on the model minority myth. So mainly we'll be talking about Asian Americans, but obviously as a category it's relative to all other racialized groups in the US, so all of it's going to be tied in. I'd like to begin my talk actually by showing you a clip from Seinfeld, because he makes much better jokes than I do. So here we go. Actually, yeah, I'll read them first. All right.
Just pop it on the counter. Oh, I got a message. Thanks, George. I got nothing to say.
That sounds urgent.
Let me call it back. Hello? Who's this? Donna Chang? Oh, I'm sorry, I must have dialed the wrong number.
Donna Chang?
Should have talked to her. I love Chinese women.
Isn't that a little racist?
If I like their race, how can that be racist? Hello? Oh, is this Donna Chang again? Yes, I am calling George. Oh, the lines are crossed. You're getting his calls. Wow, what do you know? So listen, I'm going through this stuff like a butter.
She's not with a Chinese woman.
No, I did it. I got a date.
With the Chinese woman?
She knew who I was. She saw me in a club one time. My first date ever with the Pacific Rim. I'm very excited. I'm very excited about this date. We're going to Hunan Balcony.
She's Chinese, so you suggest Chinese food?
She suggested it.
I thought Chinese don't eat Chinese.
She's very assimilated.
So that lays the groundwork for this talk, because it raises the question, if I like their race, how could that be racist? Let's go ahead and give some definitions out there and clarify basic terms. And the term that we're going to go with next is Asian American. So there's no uniform nationality, there's no set of racial characteristics, there's no common cultural background among Asian Americans that creates that common identity, right? I mean, it's an array of home cultures from various sending regions. Within any one sending region, there are multiple identities. For example, Pakistani Americans. So if you take a Pakistani American, they could well be from India, having migrated to Pakistan when it was created in 1947. And when they were from India, they could well have been from the south of India, and then at some point in their lives have migrated to another region of India. So they may speak multiple languages. They make the migration across to Pakistan. There's no way really of collapsing all these identities in any precise way. Asian American is as precise as Asia is, which covers the range of countries in Asia, all of which, as national identities, include multiple ethnic identities and multiple ethnic cultures. So I wanted to kind of unpack that term a bit. It's not a precise term, but we use it anyway. There's no Asian identity in Asia, so that people, if you ask someone who lives in any country, from Indonesia to Bangkok to China or Bhutan or Nepal, they don't recognize themselves as Asian. That's not what they affiliate themselves with, right? That identity emerges in the process of migration after they've come here. So it's only after they come to the US that they recognize themselves as something other. And that's when the identity as Asian or as even Asian American is more common in the second generation. That's when this identity really comes into play. So what do they share? If we're talking about Asian Americans and the model minority, what is it that draws these people together? How did this label emerge, right? First, they have shared historically in the US a common history of racial discrimination. And that has been the case since the mid-19th century. They also have shared exclusion from entry into the United States. So for much of that period, for much of this history, Asians have not been allowed to enter the borders of this country. And that has been the case since 1882, a little prior to that, and it continued. That legislation began to break down during World War II, but really not until 1965. So 70-some odd years of no entry for Chinese, for Japanese, for Indians, for Filipinos. There were exceptions depending on relations with some of these countries, but in general, that was the rule. They were excluded. And lastly, they have been excluded from spaces where power is concentrated. Those spaces in particular are governance, fair business, media representation, and also in educational curriculum. The reason this is important, well, before I answer that, is this changing? Sure, it's changing. Has it changed? No. It hasn't, not fully. So that's something we definitely need to work on. The term Asian American was coined during the 1960s. It emerged in the 1960s, popularized in the 1970s, and it was during the Yellow Power civil rights movement, a lot of which was spearheaded on the West Coast, where a large proportion of Asian Americans resided at that time. The term was coined then as a political identity. The movement that was taking place, especially on college campuses on the West Coast, was to be included in university curriculum and to have admissions expanded to include people who are working class. A lot of the Asian American student community there found that it was much more difficult for them to gain admissions into universities there. And once they were there were no programs that addressed their experiences. So in 1968, and I'm going into 1969, the largest university student protest in the nation's history occurred at San Francisco State University. Over 1,000 students participated, not just Asian American students, but students from the Black Student Union, and it ran the course of months. It became very violent, and what emerged out of that struggle was the first ethnic studies program in the U.S. After that, there have been ethnic studies programs throughout the country, but it's a constant struggle. I was talking to someone earlier today about Asian studies here at Rice, Asian American studies here at Rice, and I'll return to that topic at the end of my talk. So we're educators, many of us, or we are being formally educated here. What do we know about Asian Americans? What do we know? We know stuff, right? What is it that we know? We know that they're smart, they're hardworking, they're obedient, they don't rock the boat, they're well behaved. We know that Asian American women are hot. We know that men are not so much. We know that they're all valedictorians. We know that as moms, they're pretty pushy, type of moms. We know as dads that they're authoritarian or strict. What we also know is that most of these things are good, and we respect that, because it is these positive traits that, let's face it, lead them to success. This is what makes the model minority. It's these traits, right? So what's wrong with that? Sounds good. So let's return to Jerry Seinfeld's question. If I like their race, how can that be racist? And that brings us squarely to the model minority. So let's unpack this. The myth of the model minority fits hand in hand with the trope of the American dream. I'll say that again. The myth of the model minority fits hand in hand with the trope of the American dream. You all know this trope. It's the one where if you work really hard, anyone who works really hard can achieve success. It's the one where you pull yourselves up by the bootstraps, the Horatio Alger sort of story. It's a recurring theme in movies and in news articles. right? And the reason it exists, this myth, is because if Asian Americans can succeed, their material success is proof that the American dream is a real possibility for everyone, regardless of race. So what's wrong with that? Well, first, and I'm going to go through a set of reasons why many find the perpetuation and circulation of this myth problematic. So I'm going to go through, I think, 8 different reasons why. The first is that it overlooks other Asian Americans. It overlooks Asian Americans who aren't the model minority, who really haven't achieved that level of success. There are many Asian Americans who struggle at disproportionately higher rates of poverty than do white counterparts, other groups. Among refugees, for example, they have higher rates of poverty, they perform poorly in school. They're by no one's imagination a model minority, and yet when this idea of a model minority circulates, they get left out of that equation. Recent immigrants from South Asia are another example. When South Asians first came to the U.S., they came based on preference through the 1965 legislation. They entered the country because they were highly qualified or they were seeking higher education. By definition, they were a very select group. Now what has happened since 1985 or so is that this more recent waves of immigration come based on family reunification. So they are not necessarily more qualified. They just have family here and they're coming to, based on that. For students whose parents don't have that educational pedigree, for relatively recent immigrants, who don't have the higher levels of education, who don't have the higher incomes, that actually becomes a double barrier in university admissions, for example. And I'll touch on the reasons why. It becomes harder to be admitted to universities because Asian Americans, it has been shown that Asian Americans, when they apply to universities, they have to actually score higher on standardized tests and overall have to perform more strongly in order to get into the university as compared to white students. So if an Asian American student is disadvantaged, they often don't have that kind of foundation. They can't perform at the same levels because they don't have the same sort of educational support needed to perform at those levels. So if it's a race-based admission, and many universities still account for race in their admissions. That may change with the recent Supreme Court case that's underway, Abigail Fisher versus UT. But until that does change, many universities do take into account race. And so for disadvantaged Asian American students, they're slotted in with Asian Americans who many are getting in, performing at this level. You can't perform at that level, but at the same time, you are counted as Asian American. The quota has been filled. You're left out. Second reason, it damages relations with other racialized groups. The circulation of this myth, it creates and it exacerbates tensions and social distance between Asian American groups on the one hand and Latinos and African Americans on the other hand. In 1967, there was an article written for U.S. News and World Report, and this was one of several articles written during this time. In this article, Chinese Americans were praised for their hard work and and simultaneously stated that if other minorities worked as hard as this minority did, then billions of dollars would not need to be spent in order to, quote, uplift them. Putting that statement into the context of what was happening in the 1960s, so civil rights movement, and there's a lot of unrest and agitation, particularly among African Americans, that was used as a way to kind of quell the tensions that were rising. By using Asian Americans as an example, look here, African Americans, you need to behave yourselves and be quiet and work hard because look at them. They behave themselves, they're quiet, and they're making it, they're succeeding. Why can't you? Stop making assumptions. The Houston Area Survey, which is put out by Stephen Kleinberg and now the Kinder Institute here at Rice, recently did their second or third Asian American survey. It's not included in every year, it's not an annual thing, but every 4, 5, 6 years, they do a special component on Asian Americans in Houston. And part of both of these surveys, the Houston area survey in general, plus the Asian immigrant or Asian American component, it asks respondents how they feel about other racialized groups. And so it gauges how whites feel about blacks, how blacks feel about Latinos, how Latinos feel about Asians. And so all of that is configured into a really nice, pretty graph, and you can access that information online. But what's interesting and relevant here is that the two groups, or I should say one group, that in particular feels alienated or most distant or even hostile toward another group are the feelings of African Americans toward Asian Americans. Wouldn't expect that. You may expect any other configuration, but not necessarily that one. And part of those feelings, although it doesn't state in the survey itself, I would surmise part of those feelings are the fallout from constantly being compared to this model of minority. Reason number 3, because touting the material success of some Asian Americans, it conveniently overlooks the discrimination against them. If they're making it, then there is no racism. They're making it. They're not facing barriers. So why are we going on talking about racism? No need to. Some even consider Asian Americans lucky that they don't experience the level of racism that African Americans experience. Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas, back when he was undergoing the Senate confirmation hearings, he said, and this is a quote, "Asian Americans have transcended the ravages caused by harsh legal and social discrimination. They're over it. They don't face discrimination anymore. They're done." I would, in my research and in multiple other research projects, that has been disputed. Asian Americans, by and large, do still face discrimination. We'll talk about some of the figures that back that up in a little bit. Reason number 4, othering. It's a word that, if you're an academic, has sort of fallen out of fashion. It's really, really convenient, and I really like it, so I'm going to use it. Othering, with a capital O. So yes, Asian Americans are held as high achievers. But then, they're held as high achievers, they're regarded widely as hardworking and doing well in school. But then, that worth, the worth of that high performance itself, is devalued by peers and other groups, right? So Asian Americans are then labeled, or that attribute, working hard in school, doing well in school, they're labeled nerds, math and science geeks, social misfits. So even though it can be articulated that we respect what they're doing, the reality is that their work is not necessarily respected in the same way that other ways of expression and cultural performance are. Above all, with the model minority myth, they are perceived as something different from other students. These students are not like other students. This race is not like other races. Recent studies show that while students, non-Asian American students, view Asian Americans as good students, they overwhelmingly describe Asian American students in negative terms. And here are some of the results of those findings. They don't speak English well. They have accents. They're too submissive. They're stingy. They're sneaky. They're greedy. So, although, again, you hear the idea that Asians do well, it's not something that's really valued, because underlying all of that are these kinds of ideas. These views are consistent with perceptions held by many. It's not just students who are saying these things and feeling this way. They're a reflection of what the other discourses that are taking place in the broader society. Let's consider some recent incidents, and I've put together a couple of images on here that we can look at to at least begin a discussion about what Asian Americans experience beyond the classroom. This t-shirt. Asians have to go through the immigration process. Mexicans should also have to. Now, I know This guy didn't pay attention in history class because Asians were actually excluded from immigration and did sneak through the border through Mexico back when they were excluded. But I also really didn't pay attention in English class because he doesn't know his apostrophes. Asians and Mexicans. Wish I had a red pen. These are the ideas that you're seeing. Asians are well behaved, they do what's right, they do what they're told, they follow the rules. Why don't others, Mexicans, do it? So there's the model minority myth, when it's held up, necessarily is relative to a non-model minority. If there's a model minority, there are non-model minorities. One cannot exist without the others. It's not an isolation. It is always relative to another group. All right, so Abercrombie and Fitch, really popular t-shirt clothing manufacturer for teenagers, came out with these shirts. One of them says, Wong Brothers Laundry Service, 2 Wongs can make it white. Really? And you can't, I don't know how well you can see the pictures on that black t-shirt, but they're wearing, they've got slanted eyes, they're wearing these hats. These are the kinds of images that have been in circulation since the era of exclusion. These are the kinds of images that you have seen among nativist groups, and they're still there, and this is recent. This is just a couple of years ago.
I was going to ask, what year is this?
It's fairly recent. It's in the last 5 or 6 years. Yes.
It was in 2002.
Was there a backlash?
Hmm?
Was there any reaction to this?
National, and we had a protest on the gallery.
Yeah. Love a good protest. All right. The other shirt says, Abercrombie and Fitch, Buddha Bash. Get your boot on the floor. I think what I wouldn't say like, but what really struck me about the conversations that took place regarding these shirts are the way that Abercrombie and Fitch as a company responded. The shirts were designed to appeal to young Asian shoppers with a sense of humor. So in other words, if you were offended, like you apparently were offended, you had a sense of humor. Get with the program. It's funny. And then the last one. We personally thought Asians would love this t-shirt. That, I think, is a whole nother discussion about the ways that non-people of color just they aren't able to anticipate the way that people of color may react to something like this. Yes?
But it also, I hope it's okay to...
No, please, please, please.
If this were accused, if the racism charge was on behalf of African Americans, I can't imagine we personally thought blacks would love this t-shirt showing like some kind of menstrual imagery or something. Like usually, it seems like companies are overly apologetic. You know, we try to be sensitive to everyone. I don't know how to slip through the cracks. This is really stunning.
But it's not the only case. This happens again and again and again and again. There are so many. I just pulled a couple of them. There's the case of Adidas came out with ads that had like buck-toothed, slanted-eyed Asians that people were very, very offended by. There was a National Review, which is a left-leaning political magazine, and the front cover was the Clintons with buck teeth and slanted eyes. For multiple reasons, not okay, right? You hear repeatedly, just as recently as we're in April now, I think maybe January or December, there was a radio host who did a prank call on someone and pretended to have an East Asian accent of some kind. Rosie O'Donnell is known for doing ching-chongs. This kind of language mocking that is not a superficial thing. Language mocking isn't just making fun of a language. There's a deeper meaning to it. It's linked usually to social discrimination against a racialized other. I read this, I don't fully agree with it, but I do in large part. The idea that groups that are language mocked are groups that are kind of held as racially inferior, so that French immigrants, they don't get the same kind of language mocking. German immigrants, because they are white, don't get the same kind of language mocking. There are exceptions. You'll sometimes see that in comedy. You'll see those kinds of accents mocked, but it's not to the same level as racialized groups, in particular ones that are perceived as quiet and bold.
Comment about
The
the first
yes.
t-shirt.
Uh-huh.
Asians apostrophe S and Mexicans apostrophe S,
Right,
which is,
they're just not so,
they're
just not with it.
yeah, so that's told me something about the person who did the t-shirt to be candid.
The boots and hazard. Again, fairly recent. You can buy this shirt. You can go on the web and you can buy this shirt today. So I just really plucked randomly a few things that I found. If I spend all day, I could probably fill the whole day and find images to do this all day. They're there. This merchandise is for sale. And it's not to say that most people or many people view or have these kinds of ideas, but it is to say that they're there and they are a part of discourse. Obviously, discourse that can be commercialized and purchased. I'd also like to make a note about humor, just as a little kind of tangential thing. I've been to a comedy show, and the comedian was the son of immigrants from somewhere, in the Middle East, I think. I don't know which country he was from. But the point was, his jokes had a lot of those kinds of in-group humor. He made a lot of jokes at what you might say our expense, but our included him. And so it was okay. It was okay in that context to make jokes about immigrant parents and spending habits and accents and just just ways of specific ways of cultural performance. It was okay in that context. It's not okay when out-group members ridicule a group that is marginalized. So if, again, not so clear-cut lines, but if Asian Americans perform those kinds of jokes within their own group, that's their prerogative. The same debate circulates around the use of the N-word. There are a lot of young African Americans who have appropriated that term, taken it for their own, and they use it freely. It is not okay for someone who's not part of that group to use that word in reference to that. Yes.
There's also this issue sometimes, like, oh, my friend's Asian, and they thought the joke was okay. That means you're Asian too, so you should think it's okay. This actually happened this year at Rice. They served fried chicken and waffles for one of the serveries. And, I'm part of the Black Student Association, and some of our members were not okay with that. But, oh no, the main chef who made the menu's black, so you guys shouldn't be upset about it. So how do you anticipate, like, reacting to this? To these sorts of comments?
How do I anticipate reacting to?
Like, so what would your response be to someone making a comment like that?
I think that the discussion really is about power. So where power is centered and where it is not really dictates who can make those decisions. In terms of, I don't know how to react to chicken and walking. I just had some of that last week at Breakfast Club. It was really, really good. But as far as how I respond to it on college campus, I think
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that was the menu for Martin Luther King Day. That's why.
Oh.
That's why.
That's really
Sorry. That's important information. I apologize. There we go.
Okay. So someone thought that would be really black to serve the
Yeah. Okay. I bet he would have loved that too.
Yeah. What do you guys think?
Well, do you think though that, I'm thinking of like Carlos Mencia, where he has, so I don't think that necessarily being in group doesn't mean that you can't be racist and perpetuate racist.
Right, and he has been very divisive and kind of a central figure in this discussion about is it okay for an in-group member to make these very, perceptively racist comments. And I'm not gonna pass judgment on whether he should or should not, but I will say that there are many who are offended. There was a study done on Carlos Mencia and Dave Chappelle. And they both, I think Dave Chappelle no longer does this vein of comedy, but he definitely did years ago. And what was researched were the responses to their comedy online, and so there were threads that were running on the discussion. And what was found was that even those who identified as Latino, for the most part, were really offended by Mencia's jokes. It's not as if being part of that group makes it okay. I think it depends on the joke itself. If it really is just overtly racist, then it's just overtly racist, and many will find offense to that. And the same thing was found for Dave Chappelle. So being an in-group member doesn't give someone just free rein to do it. This is actually the reason that speculated that Dave Chappelle pulled back from that kind of humor is because he kind of came to terms with what I'm doing is just not, it's not okay.
Yes, he felt that his intent was not racist, but the way it was being perceived by audiences was that he was, so he had a little different, I think he was coming from a different place than Nasia was, right? That he was really upset by the perception and how he was reinforcing all the stereotypes. Yeah.
And that it was giving license to, to whites to start using the N-word and kind of just in repeating the jokes from these sketches.
Sure. So, I wanted to just throw that in there. It's not directly related to the model minority, but it still can be tied in. The fifth reason, in answer to Jerry Seinfeld's question, it diverts attention away from major inequities, and this is an important one, so if you're taking notes, I see some of you aren't taking this one. It diverts attention away from major inequities and systemic racism in American society, particularly in regards to three things: unemployment, poverty, and incarceration. So, returning back to what I said earlier on, if you sort of apotheosize, I say it right? Yeah. The apotheosis of Asian Americans, you elevate them, put them at this level and say, this is your model. Everyone else who falls short, the blame is on them. Let's look at some of the figures that we're talking about. In terms of incarceration, 1 in every 106 white men are incarcerated. For Latinos, that figure is 1 in every 36. For African American men, that number is 1 in every 15. Now we can say that that's just because they are exceedingly criminal. It is part of their DNA, it's their nature. We can really face this huge disparity and try to work out what really is happening here. There's a good book on that, and it is by Michelle Alexander. So, what is it called? Jim Crow. The New Jim Crow. The New Jim Crow. So, that's one. Unemployment. Looking at two figures. For white Americans, unemployment is 7%. For African Americans, it's 7%. Switch it. 13 African American, 7 white men. So that's the difference in unemployment rates. Huge. It's not the same. It's about 12.5 for African American women. There isn't a huge disparity between men and women. Regardless, there is a huge disparity between the racial groups. Poverty. For white children, and these figures are traced through school districts. So for white children, the poverty rate, those living in poverty nationally, is 12%. For Asians, it is 13.6%. For Hispanics, it's 35%. And for African Americans, it's 38%. So we went from 12 to 38. It's a huge disparity. And again, we can say things like they don't work hard, they don't want to work, they'd rather live on food stamps and federal aid. Or we can start to work through what really is going on.
So the argument is that the model minority myth allows an entree out of
facing this.
Or trying to sort of solve or analyze that disparity.
Right.
Because it says that it's really about behaviors and it's not about structure.
That's right. It's about behavior, it's about culture, it's about race. They are kind of racially programmed to be this way. It perpetuates those ideas about race that we don't believe in. We don't, I know it hasn't really been addressed in the sessions that I've been to, I think because we all have come to this symposium already understanding race is not real, right? It's not in our blood. We don't believe things like Jews are greedy. We don't ascribe to any of that. As societies many did in the past, but it's been discounted. But having a model minority perpetuates this idea that it is in one's, not just culture, but also in one's race. And what is race if it's not biological? Number 6, reason. It's linked to when this idea is perpetuated, model minority, it's linked to greater racism and racially and ethnically motivated hate crimes. There are, on average, something like 4 report 500 anti-Asian hate crimes in the country every year. There are many more that happen that just remain unreported. And there are many more that take place against African Americans, against Latinos, against other racialized groups. But this is part of that discourse. When we perpetuate ideas of people being culturally inferior or not doing as they're supposed to do, of being responsible for high unemployment rates, and therefore our taxes go to help them out, they're not willing to work for themselves, all of that leads into the types of violence that are exhibited towards ethnic and racial groups. Yes. Reason number 7, it places intense pressure on these groups, on group members, Asian Americans, to perform at high levels. Because to not means failure. And part of this pressure is in-group. Part of it is as parents who have come here, who are hardworking and are immigrants and have given up a lot to come here, they have those expectations for their children. But part of it is not, because the model minority label wasn't created by Asian Americans for themselves. It was created by white journalists in the 1970s to describe this group. So part of it is externally imposed. So the combination of it, this is internal expectation, this external imposition, they work hand in hand. They're not separate, they're isolated from each other. Reason number 8, mental health cost. This is something that is now enjoying quite a bit of attention. There is quite a bit of work that's now going on it. And what is being found is that there are higher levels of stress, isolation, sense of failure, confusion. I want to cite a couple of specific statistics that are actually quite startling. A recent study of teens in the U.S. found that among the major racial groups, Asian American youth had a significantly higher rate of depression than any other group. Another study demonstrated that elderly Chinese American women have a suicide rate 10 times that of their elderly white peers. Students at Cornell University make up 17% of the student body, but nearly 50% of all suicides there. Finally, another study reports that among young women between the ages of 15 and 24, Asian American women have the highest rates of suicide. What is going on? One researcher who studies mental health and Asian Americans concludes that Asian American women in particular live under immense pressure to succeed, especially to achieve well and achieve highly in school, and that this pressure is not isolated to just within the family. It is a societal pressure that's placed on them. I'm going to tell a little story. I know that I'm almost done, so I have time for the story. The story is that when I was in up to 6th grade, I did well in school and did, I guess, really well in school. And I was also labeled a nerd. And because of that, I started to distance myself by about 8th grade from that nerd identity. I didn't want to be a nerd anymore. So I let my grades drop. It was a choice. And I wanted to be cool. And I actually thought I was doing pretty well at that. I mean, I changed the way I looked, I changed the way I didn't wear a headscarf growing up. I changed the way I dressed, changed all these things. I talked in a cool lingo, I had cool friends, everything was going well. And then I was in math class, and Dwayne, I don't know what his last name, Dwayne B, who was one of the cool kids, he asked to see my report card. And I was cool. My grades were not always, I handed that report card over. He looked at it, and he looked at it, and he said, "Man, I thought you were smart." And it just sunk inside when he gave it to me. Not because he thought I was dumb, but because as an Asian American, I wasn't allowed to be anything but smart. That was the only thing I could be. Did I stop being cool? No. That's somebody else.
PhD, of course you're cool.
So cool. All right, thank you.
Yes.
Number 9, it creates pressure to assimilate into whiteness. And at that, the prestigious end of the racial hierarchy, where in reality, Asian Americans can't. fully assimilate at that end. Even if they're hired at prestigious companies, and many are, compared to white Americans, Asian Americans with the same educational qualifications, with the same years of experience, they have a lower level of income. And they are not in the same levels of management positions that their white counterparts are. This has been shown time and time and time again over numerous studies. So there is a glass ceiling. They are more often bypassed for these managerial positions. In Fortune 500 companies, there is only one Asian American who's heading a company that's not owned by an Asian American, and there are very few of those, something like 1%. So what that means is that Asian Americans, being aware of this discrimination that they're going to face in the workplace, they choose technical careers, scientific paths, places that are careers that are a little more secure in outlook, in possibility of promotion to some level until they hit that glass ceiling, and they tend to not go into careers where there's a lot more subjectivity in terms of success. All right, let's wrap up. So, for Asian Americans, a marginalized group within this model minority, they serve as an intermediary. There's something between black and brown and white, and there is such pressure to conform to white ways. Many Asian Americans, Asian immigrants will say, yeah, we are a model minority. They actually embrace that because it makes them look good compared to everybody else, right? It doesn't look good. Get a couple notches higher on the racial hierarchy. So there are Asian Americans who totally aspire to this. But being labeled near white, by some others, it doesn't shield them from racial discrimination. It's not a solution. By contrast, African Americans have for centuries been dealing with systemic white racism, and they've developed ways of understanding and resisting and talking about racism. They have developed ways of passing this knowledge on to next generations. And so they've been able to do this in a way that Asian Americans have not. Asian Americans tend to internalize this pain. They experience it and they keep it. I don't think I ever talked to my parents about the countless racial experiences I went through living in the UK and in the US growing up. I don't ever once, because I just didn't think they'd get it. And they may very well have. In fact, as I'm an adult, I have talked to my father about this, and he has gone through very similar experiences in the UK. But growing up, I don't think they had the language to really help me through that process. So it doesn't get talked about. And because of that, there aren't fully developed strategies for collective resistance. So that's something that needs to happen. And their suffering, though it's unlike every racialized group and every person within these racialized groups experiences this kind of suffering differently, it still needs to be addressed. It needs to be placed within the context of broad, problematic, and racialized hierarchies that exist. For educators in the humanities and social sciences in particular, we have a great platform to do this in. And what that means is, I think for us, incorporating their experiences into our classroom curriculum. They may not be in textbooks, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. My class, I taught a class a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, and it was the first Asian American Studies course here at Rice in something like 15 or 20 years. I didn't ask for it, students wanted it. And they got the petitions, they got the signatures they needed, they spearheaded the effort, and the class was capped at 15, and for Rice, 15 is a pretty good size for a class, for an upper level class. And the first day I walked in and there were 30 students standing room only, dragging chairs in from other classrooms. They really wanted this class, and many of them, not all, but many of them, most of them, were Asian Americans. These ideas need to be taught. I taught the class, and I ended up I scared them off. I went on forever about my syllabus, and so and I've learned, the longer you talk about the syllabus, the harder the class seems to students. So, I think too long to so the students that did remain, it's about half of them. Many of them have written me after the class, sometimes, as recently as a couple of months ago, and they talk about how their life was transformed by this class. And it wasn't me. It wasn't that I'm a super gifted educator. I'd like to believe that, but that's not what it was. What it really was is that they finally found a space where their experiences are being acknowledged and grappled with and dealt with and talked about. And so that's what needs to happen. And as educators or those who are being formally educated, all of us have room to participate in these conversations. So, returning to my question, or Mr. Seinfeld's question, if I like their race, how can that be racist? Now you know.